Well, listen, I'm so glad that you're with us this morning. I got to be honest with you, this study of Genesis has been really challenging for me personally. Have you enjoyed it so far? Okay. So, since a lot of our people are out this morning, we're going to review a little bit. And then we're going, oh, that sounds better. That sounds better. We're going to review a little bit this morning, and then we will move forward, okay? So let's start out with a reading of our scripture, Genesis chapter 1. We'll begin in verse 1. Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. And I tell you what, Wayne, on the audio this morning, these mics here, we can turn these off or down unless, all right, good deal, because last Sunday morning there was some kind of weird interference going on. All right, Genesis chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, one day. Then God said, "Let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters." God made the expanse, and separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters which were above the expanse, and it was so. God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening, and there was morning, a second day. All right, by way of review, in week number 1, we considered Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we talked about how in that original moment, the earth of His creation was formless and void. And we described the earth in this way. We said that the earth at this point was covered, shrouded by what? What we called was darkness, right? That darkness shrouded the entirety of the planet. But there was also something that covered the entirety of the planet. And what was that, class? Water, that's right. And we saw in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, how in that description, God, Elohim, right? The Spirit of God is moving, is hovering over the surface of the waters like an eagle hovering over its nest of to be eaglets, right? You have that Spirit hovering over this earth, planning for what will be the creation that comes forth, sprouting forth here shortly. And then, as we looked at last Sunday morning in the third week of our study of the book of Genesis, we began to consider verses 3 through 5. Again, we talked about the aspect where God said, "Let there be" what? Light. And there was light, and God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was evening, there was morning, one day. Yes, ma'am. Yes, it was. This was before, and I'll reference that in just a few moments as we go back by way of review. We started out last week by considering the truth, the great truth, that the reality is man in and of himself. Has man ever created anything? No. And that's something that's interesting for me, who is married to someone whose father is a very well-known inventor. I mean, he has invented the highest-selling pitching machine in the world today. And I look at his mind and his creativeness and how he takes the physics and everything and uses it to his advantage. And yet even he would tell you that, quite frankly, he's never created anything. He's only used that which was already created and put them in a fashion that was to the advantage of his design. We looked at last Sunday morning, we established that we find here, number one, the command of God. This was the first heading we looked at last Sunday morning, the command of God. Because that's where this verse really begins, is where we read, "Then God said, let there be light." That was, as we talked about last Sunday morning, that is the command of God. And the word then, as we talked about last Sunday morning, that word then indicates what, class? Right then, that's right. The immediacy of this next step. Right after God created the heavens and the earth, then immediately thereafter God said, let there be light. And let me remind you, this God that we see here throughout Genesis chapter 1, He is the sole author. He is the sole actor in the entirety of creation. And we looked, there are how many verses in chapter 1? We said this last week. How many verses in chapter 1? 31 verses in chapter 1. You can go through and you can count them, right? You can see them right there in your Bible. 31 verses in chapter 1. And if you took a ballpoint pen and you circle the word God in verse 1 through verse 31, how many times do you find the word God? 32. So it is the most, as I said last Sunday morning, the most theocentric chapter in all the Bible. It's all about God. Everything begins with God, and God is the great initiator. We also discovered last Sunday morning that our God is a speaking God, is He not? He has a mind. He has affections. He has a will. He's certainly not an it. He is a person with all the distinctives of personhood, including the personality and the things of which we just mentioned. And in whose image are we made in? God. And we have a mind, we have an affection, and we have a will. So God is present, and He's certainly not silent. And in this case, God says, let there be light. And at the beginning of the first day of the universe, including this earth, we found that this earth again was shrouded in darkness. So when God said, let there be light, why did He say, let there be light? What did we establish last? Did He say it because it's dark and He can't see how to work? Is that why He said, let there be light? No. He was planning for life. That's right. There cannot be life without light. Okay? And I gave you some verses last Sunday morning, specifically the 139th Psalm, where David says, you know, the darkness and light, they are light to you. So it's not like God had to have a flashlight to see what He was doing. That's not the way God works. The second thing we talked about last Sunday morning was the creation of God. Not talking about how God was created, because He's not created. He's always, right? We're talking about the commandment of God and what that created. God said, let there be light. And what was the creation? Light. Some form of illuminating glow. I can't explain what it is. I just know that it existed. I've read various theories, and Alan and I talked earlier this week about some of that. And, you know, I made the statement last Sunday morning that, and if you read, there's no mention of the creation of darkness. It's just there. We see it, right? And I had to think, Alan and I were talking back and forth. I had to think, well, what's the best way to reply to Alan? Because Alan has the best questions of anybody I know. And so how did I put it, Alan? Because I can't remember. Yeah, darkness is not a creation. It's simply the absence of light. And that may be true. It may not be true, but that was the best explanation I could give him. All right, that sounds good. But again, I said this last Sunday morning, so that we don't get things confused. We need to understand that the sun will not be created until what day? Day 4, okay? So, as I said last Sunday morning, God is simply speaking by fiat, and then there's light in the universe. God doesn't need the sun for there to be light. I mean, you could even go even as far deep as talking about His Shekinah glory. I mean, you could really get into all kinds of, deep discussions, but let's try to keep it as common sense as possible. God said, let there be light. There was light, okay? Third thing we looked at last Sunday morning was the contentment of God. The contentment of God. And again, as I said last time, we cannot escape or overlook the fact that when God did what He did here in this initial work, what in verse 4 did He say? He said, He saw that the light was what? Good. And the verb saw there means to oversee, right? Like an on-site inspection, I think I said last Sunday morning. So you have God here, He oversees, he like an artist, right? Who sits back and looks at what he's just done on the canvas and says, that's good, that's good. We also talked about last Sunday morning, and I wanted, Mike's not in here, but he had brought up a verse, I think he said John 1:5, and we'd already looked at 1 John 1:5. And I thought he meant 1 John 1:5, but he was actually talking about John 1:5. But the established point is here that when we're talking about God being light, God is not physically light. God is not a physical creation, is He? He is what? God is spirit, and those who worship Him in what? They're in truth, right? So when we talk about God being light, what does that represent? That's right. His goodness, His purity, His holiness. He is light, and in Him there is what? No darkness at all. And so we find here at the end of each day, whether it's verse 10, verse 12, verse 18, verse 21, verse 25, verse 31, the end of each day is completed by God saying, this is good. And then fourth, we talked about the control of God, where we see verse 4, where it says, and God separated the light from the darkness. And I loved it last week. We were talking about this, what God creates, He controls. And Janice made a statement last week that I thought was really well put, that, He is a God of control, but He does not control. You know what I mean? He gives us free moral agency. We're not marionettes, right? So God now having now created the light, having created the heavens and the earth, and it all being in essence, as I said last Sunday morning, in the palm of His hand, now He begins to separate. What God has created, He now began to divide. He made establishment of a sharp, polarizing contrast, a distinction between the light and the darkness. So what does He say here? What does He say? It says, and God separated from the light from the darkness, which implies there is still what? Darkness. Okay?
In NLT, in verse 7, and then...
We're not even to verse 7 yet. Go ahead, Jerry.
Okay, I'll wait.
No, go ahead. Let's hear it.
No, it says that, and that is what happened. God made this space to separate the waters of earth from the waters of heaven. Is He just talking about rain? Or?
We'll see that in just a little bit.
Okay, patience.
Patience. What was that? What was that movie that I saw? It was Patience, Son. What was that? I forget. I promise you, we're going to get to that. Unless the Lord comes back, and then it won't matter. All right. So, God called the light what? Day. And He called the darkness what? Night. And then finally, last Sunday morning, we talked about the clarifying of God. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5, we witness God begin to clarify things, to make forth some distinction and definition. It says, God called the light day, and the darkness He called light. So God gives the light the name, the day, you shall be called day, and God named the darkness night, you shall be called night. And why was that important? Is it just some random fact? Why is it important that in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5, it tells us that God named the darkness night and the light day? Why is it important that it tells us that God named it? Do you remember why? Well, that's important too, but there's a very big principle behind, what's that? Because He controls it. There you go. What you name, you have authority over. And you go, well, I don't understand. Well, do you have any kids? You name your child, do you not? You have the authority to name your child, and as a parent, you have authority in your household. It's a very similar principle. And back in verse 5, we see the order, right? There was first what? There was first evening, and then there was morning, which seems kind of backward to us, right? Because we start every day with what? Morning, and we think morning, evening. But why is it reversed here? Why is it evening, morning? Do you remember what I shared with you last Sunday morning? Go back in verse 2. What was the earth shrouded in? So darkness is evening, right? So when God said, let there be light, it went from evening to what? To morning. That's right, to day. And then we looked at how it closed, right? The last two words of verse 5 is very important. What are those last two words? One day. I think one of the translations somebody read last week was first day. Is that right? Not one epoch. I think I've been saying epoch. I don't know why. I always watch back all my videos, and I don't know why I was saying epoch. It's epic. Not one epoch, not one era, not one age, not one span of time. No, it's one day. And verse 5 does not end simply day one. No, it's the reverse. It ends one day. And we know it's one day because we know it's day one because the next day it's going to be what? Day two. And what is significant here in all these verses, 1 through 4, they all took place in one day, one 24-hour period of time with daytime and nighttime, with evening, then with morning. And we ended that last Sunday morning talking about this. Class, go ahead, Cliff.
You may mention this, or you may get into this, but whenever you look at the Hebrew word day, every single time that it is mentioned in the Old Testament,
it's referenced in one 24-hour period of time.
Why can't it be a reference for 24-hour period of days everywhere but Genesis chapter 1?
Right. In other words, if we're going to be consistent about the way that word is interpreted, if everywhere else is interpreted as one 24-hour period of time, why can't we do that here in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 5? Exactly. It's just common sense, right? There you go. There you go. Now, I said this last Sunday, we live in a very modern world. A lot of modern technology. And people will ask me, Jonathan, what about the carbon-14, this radioactive dating of fossils that measure billions of years? Or Jonathan, what about dinosaurs? Or Jonathan, what about the oil in the ground or the coal in the ground? And I truly believe, class, any thinking person would give some decent thought to these things. I do not believe that God says for us simply to ignore what is being said. So we started last week taking these things one at a time. We first of all talked about this one day aspect, this one 24-hour period of time, and this carbon dating, this radioactive dating, this carbon-14 dating. And we talked about last Sunday morning, the presupposition is that the geological conditions, Rebecca Hastings, something that is interesting to me is that the Jews also started their day with evening and then morning. Yeah, that's what Alan said. The presupposition that the geological conditions that are present here on earth today have been present for billions of years. If that were true, if the geological conditions of this planet had been the same from day right here to all the way back billions of years ago, then, I think that would be a fairly accurate barometer. The atmospheric pressures, geological forces all being the same, that would allow for an accurate reading. But as I said last Sunday morning, what if there was a catastrophic event that affected the entirety of the globe? An event so large that it created extraordinary upheaval. That the bottoms of the deep would be opened up, that the whole globe would be affected. Class, we come to Genesis chapter 7. We're going to see what that catastrophic event is. What do you think it is? The flood. Carbon-14 dating can only be relatable only to the point of Genesis chapter 7. And sadly, class, it would be unbelief if someone were to just say, well, that flood thing that's in Genesis 6, 7, and 8, that was just figurative water. I think it would be unbelief to say that. It was a real flood that drowned the entire human race with the exception of how many people? 8 people. So no, we can't necessarily hang our hat on carbon-14 dating. The second question that I hear, Jonathan, what about dinosaurs on planet Earth? Doesn't the idea of dinosaurs, doesn't that presuppose that a day must mean a billion years? Well, again, the belief in a global flood that submerged the entire Earth, I feel like makes for a fairly easy explanation. That the dinosaurs, they existed. People ask me, when did they exist? I believe from my study they existed before the flood. Whether they were drowned at the flood or whether they'd already become extinct before the flood, that's immaterial. But at some point they existed. Who had their hand raised? Anybody? The fact is, once you believe in the Genesis account, in Genesis chapter 6 through Genesis chapter 8, that we have a global flood that devastated the planet, when you come to that understanding of the truth of the Bible, I don't feel like the dinosaurs are that big of a problem. I would encourage you to go on to apologeticspress.org and look under their articles, because there are several great articles that do a far more intelligent job of explaining the existence of dinosaurs and their extinction and the timelines and the possibilities than I can do. Again, that's apologeticspress.org if you'd like to go on there and study. Not unless he was told to. Yeah. I don't know that he put 2 mosquitoes on there. They could have just landed on it somewhere. I don't know. Everything that I come to believe says either that I personally believe that they were extinct prior to the flood. But the point is they existed prior to the flood. Some point between the time that man was created and the flood happened, they existed somewhere in that timeline and extinct somewhere in that timeline. Yeah, that's what I was meaning. I mean, he didn't, the fact is we're not told that he sent, the dinosaurs, of course, but he's the one that sent them. Maybe he just didn't send the dinosaurs. I don't know. I don't know. Yeah, it would have been a fairly crowded ark to have a brontosaurus on there. Oh yeah, they're not, the dinosaurs are certainly not the only thing that has gone into extinction. That's very true. But what about this third one? This one is one I think about quite a bit. I grew up in Jasper, Alabama, and the road that I grew up on is called Coal, C-O-A-L, Coal City Road. What does that tell you that I grew up in? Coal country. My grandfather was killed in the mines. He was crushed in the mines in Walker County, Alabama, where I grew up. My dad was 4 years old when his father was killed in the mines. I never got to meet my grandfather, obviously. And then I moved to Texas, and you got that other natural resource, that, what is that called? Oil? Folks have said to me, Jonathan, what about all that coal in the ground? What about all that oil in the ground? So, you know, Jonathan, it took billions of years for that coal, that oil to come into existence. They'll say, Jonathan, how could you say that one day is one day when we know it would have taken all this time? Class, there's something that we need to understand. When God created the earth, class, He created the earth instantly and immediately with the appearance of age. In other words, it's a young earth with the appearance of an old age. You say, Jonathan, come on, man, that's a reach. Where do you get that from? Okay, if you think it's a reach, let me ask you about Adam. Was Adam created an infant? Adam was created as a what? A fully mature adult man. He was given, immediately afterwards, he was given adult responsibility. Immediately upon his creation, to have dominion and authority over what? The animals on the earth, right? To manage this earth. He wasn't created as though he had just been delivered out of the womb. What about the fish? What about the birds that we're going to read about later on in this chapter? God did not create the birds in a nest as little babies, did He? And then one day they would grow up and leave the nest. Is that the way it was? No. The very moment that God created the birds of the air, He created them what? Adult, mature birds. In other words, as soon as He spoke them into existence, they were what? Able to do what? Fly. Again, God created them with the appearance of what? Age, even though they were brand new. Anna? Yes, that's very true. So if God created Adam as a fully functioning adult, not a baby, created the birds of the air immediately to be able to fly, fully mature, what about the fish? To do the same thing with the fish? Then don't you think it's beyond reasonable, both logical and intellectually consistent, to believe that when God created this earth, what He created on the earth would be much similar to what He created in the earth? I think that's not a large reach. Jerry?
God that can create earth, what's the problem with oil and coal being created at that time?
No problem at all. It'd be nothing for Him. But then I got some people that'll go, I got you, Jonathan. What about 2 Peter chapter 3 and verse 8? You know, Jonathan, with the Lord, one day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years like one day. How many of you have heard that? Well, two things about that. First class, it does not say one day is 1,000 years. It says one day is like 1,000 years. In other words, class, it's a comparison. But more common sense than that, whenever in the Old Testament a number is assigned to that day, it is to be understood as a literal 24-hour day. So when God numbers the days in Genesis chapter 1, it is a signal to us that this is an actual, specific 24-hour period of time, and God does so through each successive day, each in this progression of creation, as I said last week, with stunning brilliance of what had to happen first, what must go second, what must happen third, and you cannot reverse the order. God knew the perfect order. So then in verse 5, when he says one day, again, he's not referring to some geological age or epoch of time. It's what he meant. When he says one day, that is marked and defined by, what did we read? It's defined by evening and then morning. Is that too hard to understand? One day that is defined by light for part of the day and darkness for the other part of that period of time. It seems to speak to, again, as we've said throughout this study, the awesome power of God to create everything out of nothing. All right, let's look ahead now. Move on to verse 6. Before we move on, I want to transition the class by sharing with you, listen, I'm not sure how anybody could pick up a Bible, read Genesis chapter 1, and come up with a theory of evolution. I'm not sure how any person could read Genesis chapter 1 and then theorize that particles became slime, slime became tadpoles, tadpoles became apes, and apes became humans. Where on earth would that come from? Because it's certainly not from Genesis chapter 1. It's certainly not from the mouth of God. So if it does not come from the mouth of God, to believe those things would require appealing to a higher authority in your life. And that higher authority would not be God and His Word. That higher authority would be none other than who? Man. If all you did was pick up your Bible, Genesis chapter 1, just this one chapter, and if you had a clear head and a receptive heart, you would conclude that the Bible means what it says and says what it means. If you believe that the Bible is the infallible record of the living God, then you would take what we're studying here at face value. You may say, well, Jonathan, what about science? Listen, class, I'm sorry to say this, but science cannot even decide whether a mask works, if a vaccine works, if two masks and a double boosted vaccine works. I mean, over the last few years, after everything that we've gone through, why would anyone be willing to make science the sole authority and object of truth in their life? Science has its place. Do not misunderstand me, and it is very beneficial in various areas of life. I'm alive today because of certain benefits of science and medicine. And I've said it before, on the surface, science is not anti-God. My kids come home and they tell me about what they're learning in science. I don't say, oh, you don't need to listen to that. You don't need to pay any attention to what your science teacher says. No, I don't do that because I believe there are certain areas of science that are very beneficial to know. But you cannot make it the source of truth about the creation of mankind and how everything that we have here came into existence. It cannot be the source of truth for you in that way. God has spoken in crystal clear fashion. Now, let me put it this way. It's not hard to understand Genesis chapter 1. It's not hard to understand Genesis chapter 1, It's just hard to swallow.
They actually contradict themselves in the secular viewpoint of evolution and the Big Bang Theory, because they use a lot of times a random occurrence. And a random occurrence, by definition, is not going to be a linear progression that resolves in something. It's going to be just chaos.
And a great example of that is this virus, the way it's mutated. They've had their theories on how the virus would mutate and what effect it would have. And they have been wrong more times than they have been right on what the mutation would do. It's just a fact, like you say. It's a very hard read. If you can come to the fourth word of the first verse. What is that fourth word of the first verse? Yeah, there you go. In the beginning, God. If you can come to that fourth word of that first verse, if you'll believe that word, if you'll buy into that fourth word, nothing is hard for you to accept. Once you believe in a God who exists, once you believe in a God who speaks and it comes to pass, once you believe in a God who has a sovereign will and an omnipotence, that nothing is impossible for him, then Genesis chapter 1 is frankly very easy for us to accept as it is written. I shared this with Alan. I think I shared it with Keith. I know I shared it with Cliff this week that, anytime you study Genesis chapter 1, there are going to be certain presuppositions that you're going to make. But I wanted to lean more onto the area of just taking as much of this at its word as we possibly can. Because where we start putting a lot of presuppositions, there are going to be different opinions, right? But I want to try to encourage us to accept Genesis chapter 1 as it is written. All right, we've already noted the first 5 verses and how they describe the very first day of creation, day 1, evening and morning, one day. And now we come to verse 6. We arrive at day what? Day 2. And I want you to notice our first heading, and we'll go into this more next week, but our first heading is this, day 2, the great expanse in the sky. This is verses 6 through 8. So verse 6 begins with a very important word. What does verse 6 begin with? Then. Again, meaning right then, not a billion years later. We're talking that right after God concluded the very first day, immediately thereafter, God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. In other words, God immediately continues this process of creation. And he says, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters. Now, this word expanse here literally means something that is spread out. It means the spreading out of something so that it overlays something else. Now, in the margin of your Bible, if you've got a real Bible, and not the one like I have here on the iPad, you may have a margin. Do you see a margin in your Bibles? There's a word in some of your Bibles. It's called firmament. Does anybody see that? Okay. And what this is a vast layer above the earth. It is the atmosphere surrounding the earth, the breathable atmosphere. And in verse 8, it's going to be called what? Look ahead. I'll give you a second to look ahead. What's it going to be called in verse 8? Heaven. If you got the New American Standard, it's heaven. But when we get to verse 8, I'm going to distinguish that there are how many layers of heaven? Do you know? 3 layers of heaven. According to the New Testament, this would be the first layer. The second layer would be what? Above us, outer space. And the third layer of heaven would be where? Where God dwells, right? On his throne. So when we read, for example, in verse 8, where the expanse is called heaven, it's not referring to the third heaven. It's not even referring to the second heaven. Remember Paul, what is it, 2 Corinthians 12:2 maybe? Yeah, where he's taken up to the third heaven. He had visions, right? No, this, what we're talking about here, Genesis chapter 1, verse 6, is what we call the foundational level of what is above the earth, the atmosphere. By the way, in verse 20, it's going to be described as the place where the birds fly. Sky, same, yeah. So what we are looking at here is the atmosphere above the earth. God says, let there be an expanse, an atmospheric condition amid the waters. In other words, there's going to be a separation of the waters. Now, there are waters at this point that are what? Covering the earth, a global ocean. Everything is submerged what? In water. There's no land at this point visible in the sequence of creation. But let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters so that there is a separation between the waters that are surrounding the globe and waters that are like water vapors up higher. So there is a separation. Then he goes on to say in verse 6, let it, referring to the expanse, separate the what? What does it say? Isn't that an interesting statement? Let it separate the waters from the waters. In other words, let it separate the waters that are on the earth, engulfing the planet, everything submerged underwater. Let it be separating those waters from the waters that are in the atmosphere above, such that now God is creating a breathable condition for what? For plant life, for animal life, for human life, so that they can both function and live. Again, class, what did I tell you last week? I said God is at this point preparing the planet for what? Life. So then in verse 7, God made the expanse. An expanse, again, referring to this atmospheric level that's surrounding the earth. And he separated the waters which were below the expanse. That would be the global ocean that at this point was encompassing the whole earth, the whole planet, from the waters which were above the expanse. And there would be something possibly like a protective water vapor like canopy that was in the sky above. Now, class, what's interesting, when we later on get to Genesis chapter 7 and the account of the flood, a flood that, as we said earlier, drowned the entire human race, save 8, would cover the entirety of the earth. It says in Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, look at that real quick. It says, the floodgates of the sky were opened. Genesis chapter 7, verse 11, the floodgates of the sky were what? Opened. And then in the next verse, verse 12, it says what? The rain fell upon the earth for what? 40 days and 40 nights. So there was so much water up in the atmosphere that in the days of the flood, not only were the bottoms of the deep opened and water inside the planet came shooting up, but literally the floodgates were opened above, and so much water came down of the atmosphere above that it literally submerged the entire planet. And verse 7 alludes to the fact that this expanse, this atmospheric condition, separating the waters below the surface of the earth and the waters that were vaporized up in the atmosphere. At the end of verse 7, we read what? And it was so. All right, we'll end there this morning, pick up there, continue on with verse 8. And we're going to be going through all the way through verse 19 in this next section. So put on your seatbelt. We're going to need it.